Well, we'll go ahead and get started this evening. We're delighted to have the youth with us tonight. And we're shifting gears a little bit from where we were this past month about the big questions, and we're shifting into specifically faith and science and how they relate to each other. And so, not to disappoint, but tonight is not the old earth, young earth debate night. Okay? So what we're going to do, I know some of you are expecting some heated dialogue, but not tonight. I'm going to start off 25 minutes on dealing with the whole idea that faith and science are not at war. And then we're going to shift gears, and Katie is going to talk a little bit about materialism and about some evidence from science in the last 100 years that points to a creator. And I know that wasn't a fair summary, but basically that's where we're going tonight. So I'm just going to dive into this. A few years ago, Katie Couric was on the Stephen Colbert Show, and she was talking about having been at a science conference that the Pope sponsored, and she got to meet the Pope. Now, Colbert was a little irritated by that because he's Catholic and he's never met the Pope, or at least at the time. But as Katie Couric was talking about it, she said, I just thought it was so progressive that the church began to listen to science. And when she said that, I almost fell out of my chair because that's what a lot of people believe. The idea is that Christianity doesn't play well with the other children, that science and Christianity have a checkered history at best, and maybe is even at war. Now, this is very important to me as a pastor because recently, not too long ago, this book came out by David Kinnaman entitled, You Lost Me. And it talks about the reasons that some young people are leaving the church. And one of the top reasons that were given in the interviews was that a number of young people, 29% actually, say that churches are out of step with the scientific world we live in. 25%, 1 out of 4, even believe that the church is anti-science. And that is why when Sean McDowell worked with his father, Josh McDowell, to update the classic text that was huge when I was a kid, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, when they went to update that, they responded to this charge that the church is anti-science before advancing any historical evidence for Christianity. Tim Keller, when he wrote his book, The Reason for God, he said this was one of the 7 most frequently given objections that he ran into in New York City when he was planning his church. And so the idea that a lot of people have, not just young people, but a lot of people, is the popularly held belief that science is inherently opposed to faith. And if you're going to be a person of science, then you can't be a person of faith. And that view is sometimes touted by famous atheists. Here's one, Jerry Coyne, in his book, Faith versus Fact. The title tells you what the book's about, Why Science and Religion Are Incompatible. You could probably figure this out without me telling you, but you don't need to read it because I read it. But here's what he says. My main thesis is understanding reality in the sense of being able to use what we know to predict what we don't is best achieved using the tools of science and is never achieved using the methods of faith. My claim is this: science and religion are incompatible because they have different methods for getting knowledge about reality, have different ways of assessing the reliability of that knowledge, and in the end, arrive at conflicting conclusions about the universe. That's what he's writing. So basically the idea is faith, science, they don't get along, they're in contradiction, they're at war with each other. And that warfare motif is seized upon by the media, often, as this cover of Time magazine from 2006 shows, God versus science, as if there's a battle here of epic proportions. And if you want to be on the side of reason and science and progress and logic, then you can't be a person of faith. That's for pre-modern, superstitious, tribal people. In fact, Thomas Huxley, who was a 19th century biologist known as Darwin's bulldog because he promoted Darwin, this is what he wrote. And this is actually beautifully written, even though it's dead wrong, okay? Here's what he said. Just listen to this. Extinguished theologians lie about the cradle of every science as the strangled snakes beside that of Hercules. I don't know if you remember in the myth of Hercules, the snakes, when he's in his cradle, the snakes come in and he rips their heads off. Anyway, okay. I just want it in case you didn't know that myth. Okay. Extinguished theologians lie about the cradle of every science as the strangled snakes beside that of Hercules. And history records that whenever science and orthodoxy have been fairly opposed, the latter has been forced to retire from the list, bleeding and crushed, if not annihilated, scotched, if not slain. So, I mean, it's actually beautifully written. It's just wrong. And skeptics, a lot of times when they'll pull out for evidence something like the story of Columbus or Galileo, and they'll say things like the church and people of faith have always held outdated views. They're always trying to keep science down. Now, the problem with the whole objection, as simply as I can put this, is it's a fabrication. It just simply isn't true. And although the media still props it up, and some atheists, not all, I have some friends that are very intellectually honest atheists, they don't do this, but some try to set up this straw man that the church is against science so they can knock it down. But most historians agree, especially historians of science, that it's a pure fabrication. I mean, first of all, just to use a few examples, the whole thing with Columbus, the whole idea that they just thought they were going to float off to the end of the earth, it's just not the case. In fact, here's a picture you're going to see here. This was an engraving in a textbook about cosmology that was published by the University of Krakow at the time that Columbus left on his voyage. So this was already published in a book. You can clearly see it's a sphere, it's a globe. So this idea that, everybody was like, it's just not true. The whole thing about Galileo is way more complicated. In fact, I'd commend this book to you. That's hard to see probably up there. I brought a few books with me. It's Galileo Goes to Jail and Other Myths About Science and Religion. And so because the story that a lot of people talk about Galileo is they say, look, he believed in the heliocentric view of the solar system, and the church was against that, and so they tortured him and they imprisoned him, and he was the guy proposing science, but the church was against it. That's just not what happened. In fact, Pope Urban VIII, before he became Pope Urban VIII, he was Cardinal, I don't even remember his name now, Cardinal somebody, okay, before he became Pope Urban VIII. And he was a big proponent. He actually financed Galileo's research, and he was open to the heliocentric model. He just said, listen, people in the church aren't ready for this, so you can teach it as a possibility. Like this is a theory that's growing, the evidence is growing. You can teach it that way, but you can't come down and say this is the truth, and because the church had other scientists who were believing the heliocentric model already, but they didn't feel like people were ready. Right, because of the history. So he signs an agreement, Galileo signs an agreement that he's not going to do it, but then he goes back on it. And not only does he go back on his agreement that he signed with the church, but he publishes a book and he makes Pope Urban VIII look really dumb, which, not a smart move, okay? So he did in fact get arrested. He was never tortured, and he wasn't imprisoned. He was under house arrest for like 9 years. And he could still do his research. But here's my point. The picture that a lot of people want to give is it was Galileo against the church. It's way more complicated than that. It was actually more political than it was a religious thing. And in fact, I might add, Galileo was a believer. Like this was an in-house argument. This was a family fight. In fact, if you ever read, I would commend this to you. It's a translation of Galileo's work. Unless you speak medieval Italian, then you don't need this. But if you don't speak, Italian, English is helpful. He wrote a letter to a duchess where he explains his position. And he gives, and I'll just give you he has his proposal on how to deal with new scientific discoveries. And I'm just going to give them to you. He has 2 assumptions and 2 interpretive moves. Assumption number 1 is, assume biblical inerrancy, not inerrant interpretation. In other words, what he's saying is, and remember, this is Galileo. He's saying the Bible is inerrant, but your interpretation of the Bible might not be inerrant. So you assume the biblical inerrancy, but not your interpretation is inerrant. Assumption number 2, nature and scripture cannot disagree. So in other words, if you see something in nature and you see something in the Bible and they appear to disagree, your interpretation of one or the other is wrong. Because the creator of nature and the one who inspired the Bible, same God, right? So they can't disagree. So he says when it appears like there might be some, here's interpretive step number one. Traditional biblical interpretation governs unproven science. So in other words, if a theory comes along and they're like, this could challenge the Bible, but we're not really sure yet, we don't have a lot of evidence, then he goes, you just go with your traditional interpretation until there's enough evidence. And then if there is, then proven scientific theory requires biblical reinterpretation. In other words, if you get to that point, you say, oh, okay, maybe I had this view that Scripture taught something other than the heliocentric view, but now there's all this evidence. Perhaps it wasn't really teaching what I thought it was teaching. Now, this is Galileo. So the whole idea that it was Galileo against the church, he was in the church. So this wasn't a fight between two opposing, not two things at war. So really quickly, what I'm going to do is we're going to look at three things. First of all, the birth of the warfare myth. Second, the origin of science. And third, the practice of science. So first, the birth of the warfare myth. Where did it come from? I mean, where did this idea that faith and science are at war come from? Well, in 1896, there was a book written by John William Draper called History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. And then that was followed up with a much more famous book by Andrew Dixon White entitled A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. And both of those books argued that the church was against science. In fact, J.B. Stump summarizes them with this. Here's what he writes. In these books, Christianity is cast in the role of the oppressive and stultifying stepmother who held back the young, reasonable, and progressive maiden of science and kept her from flowering through the Middle Ages. Then science broke free from the oppressive church, or so the story goes, and steadily added to our accumulated knowledge and quality of life. Basically, that's what these books made the argument. Now, Andrew Dixon White, had been a professor of English and history at the University of Michigan until Ezra Cornell invited him to come to be the first president of Cornell University, which was going to be the first thoroughly secularized university, right, to have no religious affiliation at all. So when White, and some Christians were fighting against it, were resisting it. So White, when he wrote that book, he characterized Christians as fanatics who believed in a flat earth. And so one historian puts it this way: White's book remains influential despite the fact that modern historians of science dismiss it as nothing but a polemic. White himself admitted that he wrote the book to get even with Christian critics of his plans for Cornell. So he even said he did that. So that's where it comes from. But let's compare that now, the birth of the warfare myth, to the birth or the origin of science. The truth of the matter is, if you're just somewhat objective with the historical record, is that Christian theology actually laid the groundwork for the emergence of science as a discipline. So Nancy Pearcey and Charles Thaxton have written this book called The Soul of Science. And they make a good historical argument that Christian assumptions about the universe being ordered according to natural laws, since it was created by a rational God, and that science was also intended to alleviate toil and suffering, provided the backdrop for the emergence of the scientific revolution in Europe. In fact, Rodney Stark, not to be confused with Tony Stark. I just want to do this for the youth. I don't want you guys to be confused. It's not Tony Stark. Rodney Stark is a sociologist at Baylor University, actually passed away a couple years ago. Tony Stark is a philanthropist, billionaire, Iron Man, okay? But back to Rodney Stark. Rodney Stark wrote this book called For the Glory of God, How Monotheism Led to Reformation, Science, Witch Hunts, and the End of Slavery. And here's what he points out in the book. It's fascinating. Science arose only one time in history, as a discipline now, and that was medieval Europe. And that happened because science could only arise in a culture dominated by a belief in a conscious, rational, all-powerful creator. But see, science as a discipline is actually itself based on a faith. And the faith that science is based on is the universe is rational, and we have the ability to figure it out. Those are actually statements of faith, that the universe is rational and we have the ability to figure it out. If you don't believe the universe is rational and it functions according to natural laws, and if you don't believe you have the ability to figure it out, you won't do science. And so it wasn't until there was a culture dominated by that belief that came largely, not exclusively, okay, but largely through Christian theology that modern science arose. In fact, a number of scientists, because a lot of people bring up, well, wait a second, China was more technologically advanced than medieval Europe, and that is true. China had gunpowder, they had the compass before Europe did, they had printed books before Europe did, but they didn't have a worldview that believed there was a personal God that had designed the world according to natural laws that was rational that we could figure out. And so the discipline of science arose in Europe, and Europe quickly passed up China. So China had technology, but they didn't have the discipline of science at that time. So in the 17th century, you have somebody like Francis Bacon, who reasoned from a theological principle from Christian theology that due to the fall, Adam and Eve in the fall, and sin had corrupted our mental faculties. Therefore, he distrusted purely philosophical conclusions drawn from first principles, and rather than observation. So he instead valued the power of observation, investigation, measurement, gathering data, which is another way to say the empirical method, leading one historian to write, quote, "In a nutshell, that is how belief in Adam's fall contributed to the rise of empirical science." In fact, I just read this book on Saturday, Does Science Make God Irrelevant? And the author writes this: science and theology are cousins from the same extended family. Which is, I find that a fascinating sentence that just summarizes it very quickly. And much to the chagrin of certain atheists who write books to argue against faith, the church has done more to promote science than any other institution in the world. In fact, here's a quote from a distinguished Berkeley historian, John Heilbronn, "The Sun in the Church, Cathedrals as Solar Observatories," published by Harvard University. Okay, so he's at Berkeley and is published through Harvard. These are not like Christian institutions, okay? And here's what he writes: "The Roman Catholic Church gave more financial and social support to the study of astronomy for over 6 centuries, from the recovery of ancient learning during the late Middle Ages into the Enlightenment, than any other and probably all other institutions." See, we as Christians believe God created the entire universe and we are free to study it and figure out how he did it, how he put it all together. John Calvin used to call nature the theater of God's glory. That whenever, don't you feel that? Like, have you ever been to the Grand Canyon or you've been outside when there's a clear night and you see all these stars? It is like a theater of God's glory. The psalmist said, Psalm 19:1, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands." And throughout history, some of the greatest minds in science have believed in God. Many of them have been Christians, and some of them even clergy. I know some of you are like, no. Yes, that's right. So I'm going to go through a few of them, okay? Just real quickly, and then I'm going to hand it over to her. First of all, Francis Bacon, devoutly religious man, wrote treatises on the Psalms and on prayer. He used the inductive method to record experimental outcomes. And he argued that the God-given power of discovery, by using that, we could fulfill the divine mandate to establish dominion over creation. Another way to say that is, he saw science as a fulfillment of the prime directive in Genesis 1. Right? And so he's considered the founder of the scientific method, the father of empiricism. Robert Boyle was a pious Anglican who declared scientists to be on a divinely appointed mission to serve as priests of the book of nature. And he's known as the father of modern chemistry. Then there's Sir Isaac Newton, who is considered one of the greatest scientists of all time, virtually a Christian mystic. I mean, he wrote long books on prophecy from Daniel and the book of Revelation. And this is what he wrote. He said this most beautiful system of sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. And then you have Johann Kepler, acknowledged by many to be the father of physical astronomy. He believed that he was on a mission from God, and he discovered that planets move not in circular, but elliptical orbits. So here's Kepler's third law. I'm going to read this to you, and just enjoy the irony of the fact that I'm the one reading this sentence. Okay, I get a kick out of this. This is Kepler's third law. The square of the time of a planet's revolution is proportional to the cube of its mean distance from the sun. Now, how could anybody ever figure that out? Why would you even think to look for that? D'Souza writes, Kepler did in large part because he was convinced that there was a beautiful mathematical relationship there hidden and waiting for him. Part of his Christian vocation was to find it and promulgate it to the greater glory of God. Kepler's success leads to the surprising recognition that religious motivation can sometimes result in breakthrough discoveries that change the course of scientific history. It's amazing. Kepler had studied theology at the University of Tübingen, and he was going to be a theologian, but then he decided that God was calling him into astronomy. And so he wanted to glorify God that way. Here's another, I just got introduced, because I just read this book on Saturday. I've never even heard of her before. Maria Sibylla Marian. Has anybody ever heard of her before? Okay, 17th century entomologist, okay? She was obsessed with insects. She bred them, she studied them, and her dad was an artist, so she had learned art from him. So she would illustrate it. And so in one of her first books was on the transformation from caterpillar to butterfly. Thank you. What's that word? Butterfly. And so it's one of her first books, and she did all the illustrations herself, and she had done the study herself. And in her preface, this is what she writes. These wondrous transformations have happened so many times that one is full of praise for God's mysterious power and his wonderful attention to such insignificant little creatures and unworthy flying things. Thus, I am moved to present God's miracles such as these to the world in a little book. Just fascinating. I'm now a big fan of hers. There's a bunch more. Gregor Mendel, he's the father of genetics. He was a Catholic monk. He did his scientific work in a monastery. Georges Lemaitre, I always mispronounce his name, was one of the first to propose the idea of expansion of the universe. I could keep going, but some of you are thinking, okay, but they're all dead and they dressed really funny. And that's true. But there's no less scientists today who excel in their field and have a deep and abiding faith. A couple of them are here in the audience today. But just a couple others real quickly. Alistair McGrath has a PhD in molecular biophysics at Oxford, also has a PhD in theology. And so he's written a systematic scientific theology where he tries to incorporate natural theology and the views of molecular biophysics with theology. John Polkinghorne was a scientist in particle physics at Cambridge, head of the Department of Theoretical Physics. He was Stephen Hawking's boss, and he left Cambridge to become an Anglican priest. May have heard of this guy, Francis Collins. He was the director of the Human Genome Project and director of the National Institutes of Health under Obama, Trump, and Biden. Interesting. Can you imagine the whiplash of that? Anyway, I'm not going to be political. But anyway, here's my point. It's not, faith and science are not at war. In the 20th century alone, 65% of the Nobel Prizes went to Christians. In chemistry, it was 74% of Nobel Prizes went to Christians in the 20th century. And if you add other religions, not just Christianity, but you add Jews and Muslims, the percentage goes almost to 90%. Here's my point. Faith and science are not at war. You can be a deeply spiritual person with an abiding faith and a personal relationship with Jesus and study his world with the tools of science. So, now that I made that argument, Katie is going to come and she is going to take that and move forward from here. So, welcome her. Yep. If you hit that. Yep.
Very cool. So I'm Katie. I've been coming to New Life. Next week will be 20 years. So the first time that I did something on faith and science apologetics, was when I was pregnant with my second born, and she's going to college next month. So some of you have been very faithful. I think Dylan has a PhD. I think you were like in middle school during my first talk or something. So anyway, I've been teaching science apologetics for about 22 years, and it's just one of my passions. So leaving off where Tim was talking about how faith and science are not at war at all, but there was a big shift where people started thinking that around the time of Charles Darwin, which you've probably heard of. And I think Richard Dawkins is correct when he says that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. And was that the first time atheism just popped into existence? No. Was it the first time that evolution had ever been hypothesized? No, absolutely not. It had been around since the ancient Greeks or whatever. But Darwin is the one who made it science-y. Okay, so he made it possible to think through mechanisms of there being no God. So it's really important to understand that it's actually not the scientific method that has a problem with God. It's the worldview that was wedded to science during the time of Darwin, and that's called materialism. So have you guys ever heard of materialism? Not like a material girl, go shopping type of thing, okay? But materialism meaning that matter is all there is. There's no God, there's no soul, there's no angels, there's no demons. Do any of you have friends who, I teach high school, so I'm just talking to you guys a lot. But do you guys have any friends who might think that, okay? If you've ever seen Nacho Libre, when Nacho asked Stephen Esqueleto, why have you not been baptized? And what's he say? I believe in science. Okay, yeah, so that's, why are you always judging me? Okay, so it's not that science is against God, it's that science was wedded to materialism. And how that happened through Darwin, I would, if you come next week, we're going to dismantle Darwin, and we're going to talk about what he was right about and what he was wrong about. But it's interesting that you use the analogy, White's analogy of the evil stepmother, because I have materialism as Prince Charming, rescuing poor Cinderella science from the evil stepmother of theism. But that wasn't the case before Darwin. He actually, science classes were called natural theology classes when he went to medical school. So I want to make sure that I get the youth out of here at the right time and for childcare as well. So I'm going to quickly go through 4 discoveries in the last 100 years that pretty much show that materialism and science should not be married anymore, okay? So universe expansion, you mentioned Lemaitre. So the time of Edwin Hubble, this is 1920s, he and some other people calculated redshift, where in looking at visible light on the spectrum, we're not gonna take too long on this, but the red colors, the red light is stretched out more, okay? It has a longer wavelength. Okay, maybe you've learned that in physical science before. And a bunch of scientists were realizing and calculating that, noticing that light way out in the galaxy was stretched, okay? And that's why it's called red shift, okay? And they realized that things in the galaxy, other galaxies, are moving away from us. And Hubble was the one who is accredited to figuring out that the universe is basically expanding in all different ways, spherically, or out from us, okay? So that has some philosophical implications. So we've got the universe going like this. Well, what if we push rewind? It all goes back to a beginning, okay? And at the time, the universe was thought to be static, okay? That's what Albert Einstein favored, and Sir Fred Hoyle, other astrophysicists, favored a steady state universe and not having a beginning. And so with Einstein's field equations, coupled with this redshift, and a lot of math in there, yes, it was a priest, Lemaitre, who formulated a new cosmological model, which Sir Fred Hoyle didn't like and mockingly later called it the Big Bang, okay? And that just stuck. So now we just call it the Big Bang, okay? So sometimes as Christians, when we hear that, we're like, oh, Big Bang, that's bad. But actually, the Big Bang, this new cosmological model, showed that the universe hadn't just been around forever. It had a beginning. And it could either have started or not started. It was contingent on a beginner, somebody actually starting it, okay? So you have physicists who didn't like that and were very open to that. And I didn't bring my glasses, so I'm going to turn around and read the quote. But one of the famous physicists of the time and astronomers, Sir Arthur Eddington, said, philosophically, the notion of a beginning of the present order of nature is repugnant. I should like to find a genuine loophole, okay? But in physics, it's math. So if the math says it, then you have to, you're just going to have to deal with it. And you might have read about Albert Einstein and how he called one of the biggest blunders of his career, some even say he said life, that seems a little much, but that he actually put in a constant in his equations to try to make it so the universe would still be static. But then you can see pictures online of him with Edwin Hubble and looking in the telescope and him finally saying, all right, yeah, I can't fight this any longer. The universe has a beginning, okay? So whether you like it or not. Pastor Tim has read this quote in sermons before by an astronomer, and he reads it much better than me. It's like very dramatic. If your mic was on, I'd make you read it for me. So for the scientists, this has to do with basically coming to the conclusion that there was a beginning by all of this crazy technology and math. They figured this out. For the scientist who's lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He's scaled the mountains of ignorance. He's about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over his final rock, he's greeted by a band of theologians who've been sitting there for centuries. Obviously, the book of Genesis says, in the beginning, there was a beginning. Hubble's student, a guy who continued, a physicist who continued his work on universe expansion, started as steady state materialist, but he switched, he flipped sides. He says, it was my science that drove me to the conclusion that the world is much more complicated than can be explained by science. It's only through the supernatural that I can understand the mystery of existence. So it took him many decades, but he came to that point because of experimental data, the empirical method of science collection, not a worldview that he was filtering everything through. Then the guy who won a Nobel Prize in the 60s, discovering, he's a physicist who, he and another guy discovered cosmic background radiation that finally solidified the Big Bang as a concrete cosmological model. He has a very famous quote saying, the best data we have are exactly what I would have predicted had I nothing to go on but the 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, and the Bible as a whole. So that's our first, within the 100 years of science discoveries. The second one would be the universe fine-tuning, or sometimes this is called a Goldilocks universe, where Goldilocks is like, oh, it's too hot, it's too cold, oh, this is just right, okay? It's basically for life to come about in a universe, everything has to be just right. So that's why it's called the Goldilocks universe. So Stephen C. Meyer, who has an undergrad in physics and then a PhD from Cambridge in philosophy of science, he wrote a book called The God Hypothesis. And if you notice, I didn't bring my books because I'm a library girl. So it's at the library. That's where I read it. So you can read it too because you pay taxes. And so you should use the library. So, but he notes that since the 1950s, physicists have discovered that life in the universe depends upon a highly improbable set of forces and features, as well as extremely improbable balance among many of them. So basically, he's just saying there are all of these constants in the universe that have to be just right. I have like the top 5 here because depending on what book you read or who you talk to, there could be 6, there could be 29. One guy on his blog listed out like 200 that I could think of. So the top 5 are always mentioned, but basically you have these finely tuned constants like the gravitational force, electromagnetic, strong nuclear, weak nuclear, basically holding atoms together or them flying apart. The universe either collapsing or flying apart, or you have atoms not being able to bond. You can't even have chemistry. All of these things need to be just right. When I honestly, even as a Christian, when I heard this, it was not really my favorite. And I think it's growing on me the more that I've read, but sometimes some people will think that basically it's saying, okay, if I put a blindfold on and I shoot an arrow at the wall, and then I go up to that spot and like, look at this spot. It landed right here. It could have landed what's the probability that it landed right here on the wall? And you're like, big deal. You have a blindfold. It's going to land somewhere. And it just happened to land in a universe with life, okay? But the more that I've read about the fine-tuning thing, don't think about it that way, but you have a blindfold on, and you hit target after target after target after target to precisely right in the middle without looking. And then you would think, okay, if someone did that, they can actually see through the blindfold. They're cheating, okay? So, I'm sorry. So back to Sir Fred Hoyle, who we mentioned gave the Big Bang its name, and he kind of made fun of it at first. He's definitely a materialist. He came around as well because of these finely tuned constants in the universe. So he says, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology, and there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question, okay? Now, when I'm reading these quotes by these people, does that mean they get born again and love Jesus, okay? No. Several of them, including Fred Hoyle, is going to hypothesize panspermia. We were made by aliens. That's got to be what it is, okay? So, but what all these quotes demonstrate is that the simple conclusions that can be made from the data is that somebody designed this, somebody started this, okay? And the only reason why we can't accept that is because of, what was that worldview? Materialism. That was wedded to science, okay? Materialism becomes very controlling in what data how data is going to be interpreted, how it's going to be filtered, what conclusions can be made, okay? So, Roger Penrose, another physicist, this now tells us how precise the Creator's aim must have been, namely to an accuracy of 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd. So this is basically the probability of life coming about with all of these finely tuned constants tuned to exactly where they need to be. This is an extraordinary figure, but why was the Big Bang so precisely organized? So And then another one by the student of Hubble, who he also started talking more like he believed in design because of the evidence of finely tuned constants. I find it quite improbable that such an order came out of chaos. There has to be some organizing principle. God to me is a mystery, but is the explanation for the miracle of existence, why there's something instead of nothing, okay? He's also, well, we also have, you've probably also heard the quote, I didn't put up here, it's pretty common. Fred Hoyle is also the one who says it's like if you had a bunch of airplane parts in a junkyard and a tornado came through and made an airplane. Okay, so that's the same guy also. Paul Davies is the one who writes, the physicist, contemporary physicist, who writes the most about the finely tuned universe and calls it the Goldilocks principle. There is for me powerful evidence that there's something going on behind it all. It seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming. Okay, then why can't we just say it was designed? Because materialism says no, it's not allowed. Okay? Ever since the late 1800s, materialism is pretty controlling and kind of lets science not speak its mind anymore. Okay? So the next one, and this would be my favorite, would be biological information in machines. So it's gonna, when we're talking about like DNA, okay? So I'm moving forward. We're in like the 50s into the 60s. So in 1953, you have Watson and Crick and Rosalind Franklin figure out the double helix of DNA structure. A few years later, Crick figures out this is code. This is actual information that you take 4 digits. Any high schoolers want to tell me the 4 letters? You don't have to say the whole word of the base, of the nucleotide base, just what are the letters? I teach freshman biology. I know you had to learn this. Okay, Colin, yeah. Okay, good, yeah, so A, G, T, and C. So those stand for base, yeah, the first letter of the base nucleotide bases. So our alphabet has how many? 26, okay? God's has 4 inside, okay, in your cells. So these 4 bases are read by machines and translated into certain amino acids that then link up together, and if they're linked just right in a precise order, they fold into the perfect shape, just like your key is a perfect shape to unlock a door. If it's the wrong shape, nothing gets unlocked, and you have a disorder that can hopefully be treated by modern medicine, okay? But, so this whole DNA to RNA to protein was understood through the 50s and 60s and became the central dogma of biology. So, but with this came a really big problem because Darwin only had to explain matter and energy, okay? So in my class, we read Darwin's Origin of Species, and he's like, you know, imagine like a bear is swimming with his mouth open through the water, and you know, after many generations, it will evolve into a whale, okay? And you read that now and that's okay. We laugh, we're like, silly Darwin. Okay, but he didn't have freshman biology, okay? He didn't know about DNA, and that was okay. And I have a special place in my heart for Darwin, and we'll talk about him next week, so I won't go into that too much. But just that he didn't have to grapple with that. Materialists of the late 1800s, early 1900s didn't have to grapple with any of this, okay? So my husband's great-grandmother, Stella Tappmeyer, actually wrote a book exactly 100 years ago in 1925. It was called The Battle, and it's this fictional novel of a Christian basically convincing this atheist, who she thought was so handsome, and they have these conversations about why evolution is wrong, and of course he does convert and then become missionaries, so it's a perfect ending. But I was just reading what Stella was up against. Like, she didn't have universe expansion. She didn't have finely tuned constants. You definitely didn't have DNA. Just life was way different 100 years ago when it comes to this conversation, okay? So anyway, so now materialists have the problem of actual information. You don't have to just say where matter and energy came from. So in the problem, this is a biophysicist, a German guy, I will call him Olaf, but the problem of the origin of life is clearly basically equivalent to the problem of explaining the origin of biologic information. Like, where does meaningful code come from out of nowhere? Okay? Sorry, this for me is where it just, and same for intelligent design scientists. Like that whole movement started in the late 80s, 90s, because they're like, okay, this is getting ridiculous to say that this just popped out of nowhere. So DNA, or genetic code, has all the hallmarks of language. You have a sender, you have a recipient, it has meaning through symbols and letters, and I'm gonna have to get a drink of water, sorry. And so it gives meaning and causes the recipient to take action. So it's language. Which is why Francis Collins, the head of the Human Genome Project, ended in 2003, and he wrote the book, The Language of God, because he's a geneticist. All right. And this, William Dembski, he actually has like 7 degrees. Sorry. But he wrote a book called The Design Inference in 1998. And it's a lot of math, because one of his PhDs is in mathematics, and one of his masters is in statistics. And I actually got to sit in on his class when he taught here at Southern Seminary for like a semester. And getting to meet him, like, picture a teen girl meeting Taylor Swift, but instead of a teen girl, like a huge pregnant lady in a pink sweatsuit. But I was like so excited. And one time he was talking about something in class, and one of the guys was like, one of the PhD students, he was like, we were talking about science, and he was like, do you have a degree in this? And I was like, this is awkward. He has like 7 degrees and all of this stuff. Anyway, he wrote a book called The Design Inference, which is a lot of math. And but I'm going to boil it down. He coined the term specified complexity, where complex means there's a really low probability of this happening, okay? And specified means that it meets a pre-existing pattern. And when we say pre-existing pattern, we just basically mean it has meaning. It's meaningful, okay? So we're going to put this through some examples. All right, so if someone told you, like, okay, this pattern, this right here, this actually formed because of the unique chemical composition of this granite, and it's from water erosion. And you're like, water erosion can't do that. You're like, but over millions of years, given a long enough time, okay, why would you not believe them? This is highly complex. If you were to look at all of the drainage patterns on mountains all over the world, they're all like very different. There's a very low probability of all of them. So you could actually go to any mountain, look at the drainage pattern and say, oh, that's really complex, because there's a low probability. It's not just complexity that's going on here. And it's also specified. It meets a pre-existing pattern in your mind of actual people with names. That's why you're not going to believe that that just happened naturally without an intelligent agent, without a mind, okay? So you infer design. Or if you had someone try to convince you that hieroglyphs are made from wind erosion, of just the right climate in Egypt, and it just nature can do that sometimes. I mean, nature's wild. It does amazing things, okay? So why are you not going to believe them? It's complex, okay? It's not just complexity, but it's specified. It's specified complexity. This meets an actual pattern that you can decipher, thanks to Rosetta Stone, and it makes sense. There's meaning behind it, okay? So his whole book is just looking at things in nature and saying, what is it that makes us know or infer that it had to have been designed and not just come about by natural processes? So here's some pictures I took of some bushes. So when you're looking, sometimes I'll be thinking about this, and so I saw these bushes, and it's like, I think, could someone convince me that they just grew like that? Maybe. I mean, I don't know. Like, if you're like, oh, no, there's a species of bush that just grows straight up at 90-degree angles. And okay. And they're like, well, what about this one? Would I believe that was just naturally, grew that way? I'm like, I don't know. But then, this one, I would be like, no, I'm not, okay? So his book, basically, all the sounds I just made, like, okay? Replace that with math, and that's his book, okay? So it's a very, very mathy book. But boiling it down, he makes a great point that if you have complex and specified information, you always infer design. So that's exactly what SETI is, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. What are they looking for? Just complex signals from space? No, because those come from quasars and, stuff shooting stuff out all the time out there. They're looking for stuff that's also specified, okay? So you guys are, many of you are too young, but this is a movie. Does anybody know what movie this is from 1997? Contact. All right, good, with Jodie Foster, okay? So she's searching for extraterrestrial intelligence, listening for signals, and I don't know if you remember the message. I actually had to Google it. But what was the message she got to know that there was intelligence out in the universe? It was prime number code that had message encoded in it to build a spaceship. Okay? And so then, of course, they knew this was intelligence trying to get a hold of them. Oh, I can think of another code that is specified to build machines. Oh, it's in every one of our cells going on right now, okay? So the DNA to RNA to ribosome, building proteins coming together to make machines is not just complex. Okay, people will say, well, oh, that's just an argument of complexity. No, we're not just saying, oh, it's complex. We're saying it's specified. Name anything that demonstrates meaning, that has meaningful, recognizable patterns encoded in it, that we don't infer design. Okay? So there was a book that came out at the same time, Tim mentioned God Delusion in 2007, with Richard Dawkins. The same year, Anthony Flew, who switched, for decades, he had been an atheist. The book says world's most notorious atheist. I don't know about that, but that's a little much. But you can watch his YouTube debates against Christian philosophers from when he was an atheist, and he changed his mind and wrote a book about it in 2007. He says, I now do believe there is a God. I now think it does point to a creative intelligence almost entirely because of the DNA investigations. What I think the DNA material has done is it's shown by the almost unbelievable complexity of the arrangements which are needed to produce life, that intelligence must have been involved in getting these extraordinarily diverse elements to work together. So this is not someone who He would tell you he didn't come to God in a church, he came to God in a lab. And more and more, that has been happening because of specified complex information in our cells and molecular machines. So sometimes I show videos of these. We don't really have that much time, but it would be really great if you look at the animations of Drew Barry. He makes the best animations of what's going on inside of the cell. The bacterial flagellum, this is an actual photograph of the bacterial flagellum motor that has 240 proteins all working together at one time. And like we said, those proteins are the right shape because they folded from the right code getting in order, okay, from a whole information processing system. So that was a machine that was made famous by Michael Behe, Darwin's Black Box in 1996. But now there have been over 400 molecular machines. And this one's actually quite large. One of my favorites is ATP synthase, which you have to learn about in freshman biology because that is the Krebs cycle, the citric acid cycle on the electron transport chain. When you're memorizing those things, you're actually memorizing names of molecular machines, okay? So, no wonder Francis Crick, who was co-discoverer of the DNA double helix, also a proponent of aliens seeding us, had to say, biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed but rather evolved. It's like, you just really want to think that, but just stop it. Yeah. Don't do it. Yeah. You can't do that, okay? We have to censor our minds. So Richard Dawkins, who wrote The Blind Watchmaker, also at the library, he wrote it originally in 86. And the whole point of it is for him to basically write a narrative that can replace a design narrative of the Bible. It's kind of like reading Aesop's fables, honestly. But he says that biology is the study of complicated things that give appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Well, they look that way, but that can't be. Well, why not? If the scientific method is looking at data, making observations, and making this most simplest conclusion that goes along with those, well, why not? Because it's not allowed. Okay? Because materialism is censoring science. So he also says in the book that the whole idea of his book, The Blind Watchmaker, is that we don't need to postulate a designer in order to understand life or anything else in the universe. We are here concerned with the kind of solution that must be found because of the kind of problem that we're faced with. He's like, I'm trying to write this book to find a solution to my problem. And on another page, he clearly outlines the problem. The problem is complex design. Like, I don't like this, okay? So I need to write some other stories to try to explain where life came about on its own through material processes because anything non-material is not allowed. All right? So that was my third one. The fourth one are immaterial minds. So this is become it's very, very common in neuroscience research now, that the best conclusions for things that they are discovering is that there is an immaterial mind separate from your physical brain, which, if you remember with materialism, that says that all we are just meat machines, all we are is just our brain, just random firings in our neurons, okay? Which, if that was the case, why would I even listen to these people if all they are random firing neurons? But anyway, so in neuroscience, all the way back to the 1930s, so even when Darwinism, like social Darwinism, was in full swing and they're like trying to fix criminals by putting ice picks through their brain and all kinds of crazy stuff if you want to ever learn about the eugenics movement. But back in the 1930s, you have neuroscientists, Wilder Penrose, actually mapping the brain by doing brain surgeries on people when they're awake. And yeah, you're like, ah! But you think you can't feel it. You don't feel pain in your brain. So he would actually be having conversations with people while he's removing parts of their brain. And it's like, why would he do that? These are mostly people who had very bad epileptic seizures. So he's trying to help them. Don't worry, okay? But he's like, he thought it was really weird that he's like stimulating all these parts of the brain because he's trying to find, okay, what's causing the seizure so he can try to take it out. And he realized that he could like poke your brain and he could get you to remember something. He could get you, obviously, to like shake or something. He could get you to have some feelings. But he could never make you think abstractly. And he thought it was so strange that even when he one time stimulated a guy's brain and he had a memory, that guy started talking to him about that memory. He knew he was still in an operating room. It's not like, oh, now my brain says I'm in this different place because all I am is a brain and now it's having a memory. He actually talked to him and had a conversation about the memory that was evoked. And things like that, that's kind of went against the idea of materialism, just showing that, well, he came to the conclusion that we must have a separate consciousness outside of our material brain. This is a quote. He says, he wrote a book when he was older in 1975 called The Mystery of the Mind. And he said, what a thrill it is then to discover that the scientists too can legitimately believe in the existence of the spirit. And his mentor, Sir Charles Sherrington, who basically invented neurophysiology, also came to that viewpoint just from brain operations. How much time do I have? Okay, I'm just going to say that studies on split brain is also really fascinating when they don't want the seizures to spread to the other side, to the other hemisphere, because then it gets really bad. They'll actually cut your brain in half, where one side can't talk to the other anymore. And through these studies, through the 80s and all the way up until like 2017, I think was one of the ones on split brain patients, it's become very clear that even though there's split perception, because one hemisphere controls one side of the body and one the other, same with like even the field of vision and everything, that when each hemisphere is giving conflicting information, like parts of a story or lines going separate ways, that the subject uses an immaterial mind or consciousness to integrate all the conflicting information that's coming in from one side and coming in from the other side, and it's like, boop, 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 and can figure it out and put it together. And that was not expected in a materialist worldview at all. They thought, well, you're going to be two different people now. We just split your brain in half. So there's also really fascinating studies with like conjoined twins who share parts of their brain, but yet they are two separate consciousness, kind of along the same lines. And then the neuroplasticity of the brain is like mind-blowing. So they have done research on people who had half of their brains removed as children and come back to them as adults. And they've actually, even though you would think that they need both sides because both sides have the networks to make all the connections, an immaterial consciousness will actually just re-network, change the architecture, and they are just fine with half their brain. So I find that fascinating. When I first started teaching in Kansas City, one of my A+ students, it was a 7th grade like earth science class, I found out that he was missing a big chunk of his brain, that his mom had been on drugs, he was adopted, he was born with a big portion of his brain gone, and I'm like, how can he be an A+ student if he doesn't have all his brain? Like, how does that work? But now there have been all of these studies where your mind will actually re-network the physical matter of your brain, okay? So Jeffrey Schwartz came out with a book called Mind and the Brain. I think it was like 03. That's kind of small. Yeah, 03. And he says, the brain, to be sure, is indeed the physical embodiment of the mind, the organ through which the mind finds expression and through which it acts in the world. And he actually helps cure people with OCD, like ACDC, like OCD, and through mindfulness. And but he has lots of stories in the book, but one of them was when there were these concert musicians who would like play a lot of, I think they were mostly pianists. At some point they would get like to where their fingers wouldn't move anymore, and they're like, oh, maybe you have tendonitis, or, and the doctors didn't know what to do, and so they'd end up at a neurologist, and I'm like, why can't I move my fingers? And some neuroscientists, like experimenting with this whole mind and the brain and mindfulness, had them focus on moving each finger independently one at a time, even though they couldn't do it, but they had to like just mentally think about it, make their mind, make their brain think it was doing it, until after like a lot of meditating on it, they re-networked, because what had happened was they had been playing chords so much, their brain chunked their fingers together, like into chords. So their mind had to re-network their brain into single digits. And I just find that fascinating. I know that a lot of times when we're talking about renewing of our mind and God saying, meditate on this, renewing your mind, it'll change your mind, and you're like, oh, that's such lovely thinking. It's like, no, this is actually neuroscience, okay? So, The Immortal Mind. This is a book I read on Saturday as well. It's a different one, but yeah. So this one just came out this year. It's by Michael Egner, and he's a neuroscientist who, after 7,000 brain surgeries, came to the conclusion, I'm sure somewhere in the middle of them, that there has to be an immaterial mind. And I like this quote from the book. He said, when I write a mathematical equation on a piece of paper, the area of my brain that generates the movement of my right hand can be localized to a millimeter accuracy on the precentral gyrus of my left frontal lobe. But my understanding of the equation cannot be localized at all. And when he goes back and talks about Penrose in studying epilepsy, he always, this guy always says that there's no math seizures, there's no Shakespeare seizures, there's no abstract thought seizure, because that's not a part of your brain. That's your immaterial mind. And in the book, he also brought up some other stuff that I've read and I think is just fascinating, where he said that when they have patients in a coma, everyone knows, and the nurses know, like, don't talk bad, because sometimes they wake up and say, I was aware and I heard what you were saying. They're like, and they've also been able to monitor like their blood pressure, even though they're in a coma. And you're talking about their diagnosis and how horrible it is. They'll actually have the monitors show their blood pressures going up, like you're stressing them out, because even though they look like they're not aware, many times they are aware. And so in 2010, the New England Journal of Medicine published studies using functional MRIs that show many people in persistent vegetative state can recognize auditory commands and imagine spatial and motion concepts. So I need to let you go. You're going to have to go soon. But basically, they just say, imagine this, imagine that, and they see the areas of the brain that have to do with the spatial or the motion lighting up, just like people who are not in vegetative states. So just more evidence that there is consciousness apart from the brain. And then finally, along with the immaterial mind, are near-death experiences, which used to be kind of like fringe, like crazy, spooky stories or something, but they are very much in the realm of science now. And in 1991, that was the first time that a patient was basically they put her temperature down to stop her brain, stop her heart, kill her, basically, to stop an aneurysm, and then brought her back to life. And she recounted everything that went on in the operating room because she was above and watching, okay? And this happens a lot, and the better our technology gets, the more this is happening. I was talking about this in my class, my high school class, and the kid's like, oh yeah, my aunt died and went to hell and came back. It's like, this is somewhat kind of normal thing now, I guess. So, so there have been a lot of studies. I'm not going to go into them because I want to be respectful of time. My favorite ones, and the ones that got me being like, okay, this is not just your brain being deprived of oxygen. This is not just anesthesia making you like flip out, okay, were people who had been blind from birth. And when they die, they come out of their body, they see everything that's going on, then they save their life, they come back in their body, and they say everything they saw in the room, even though they've been blind from birth. And that was the one I was like, okay, yeah, these are real. So, all right. So, Antony Flew, another quote, "I now believe the universe was brought into existence by an infinite intelligence. I believe that this universe's intricate laws manifest what scientists have called the mind of God. I believe that life and reproduction originate in the divine source. Why do I believe this, given that I've expounded and defended atheism for more than half a century? The short answer is this. This is the world picture, as I see it, that has emerged from modern science. Modern science is telling us these things. You were designed. There is a beginning. There is a creator." So these are I'm not going to go through the 4 because we're running out of time. So just summarizing those 4 things that I went through, just like those are my big favorite ones. Why is it that if this is what modern science is saying, if these are the simple conclusions from empirical data, why are we still saying, oh, well, science proves there's no God? Or why are we saying, well, we can't accept those things? And it's because of that materialism that's censoring science. This is a famous quote by an evolutionary biologist in an article in 1997. He said, "It's not the methods and institutions of science. It's not that they somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world. I've just showed you they don't. But on the contrary, that we are forced by prior adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute. We cannot allow a divine foot in the door." Meaning, we don't want God to be the answer, okay? So materialism is why the intelligent design movement is pushing back and saying, this is Michael Behe, the philosophical commitment of some people to the principle that nothing beyond nature exists should not be allowed to interfere with a theory that just flows naturally from observable scientific data. So back to the Prince Charming and science, Cinderella science, okay? So yes, they did have a thing, okay? Like over 100 years ago, okay? And I was still being taught in the 90s when I was getting a science degree in university, I was still being taught that they were living happily ever after, okay? And that anything that goes against materialism, well, that's just not true, okay? But in fact, if you look at the last 100 years, materialism has turned out to not be a Prince Charming, okay? He's more like Gaston, where he's really pushy. He won't let science speak her mind. He thinks that he's the only answer. And materialism needs to understand that even though they did have a thing, she's just not into you anymore.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Very
Thank
good.
you.
Outstanding. That was outstanding. Okay, so the youth now are going to go and break up into your small groups, and you have some discussion questions out of that, so you guys can go now. Thank you for being here.